Jezrick.
Hey, I've been wanting to make this video for a while. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was how being somebody that makes music and makes music with a variety of different pieces of equipment. Sometimes I find myself, well, not sometimes, but a lot of time, I find myself spending more time troubleshooting issues between the different pieces of gear that I use than actually writing music and recording music. So a constant journey that I feel like I've been on has been to figure out the best sort of workflow or how I can have the various pieces of gear set up that I use in a way that I don't have to troubleshoot issues, or that it works as I expected every time I turn it on. So I've reached this kind of milestone, I feel like, in that journey. I call it the synth desk, and it's essentially a lifting desk that can be in seated or standing position that has these various keyboards, instruments that I am using right now. And the whole thing is pretty much self-contained, meaning it doesn't rely on a computer in order for me to sit down and start working on music. You can kind of just turn it on, load up a template that I've kind of made, and start going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is set up, and maybe you'll find that helpful on your journey. So the first thing is, how do you get all of these pieces of equipment to play nicely with each other? Of course, they all support MIDI, the common protocol for synthesizers and keyboards and stuff to kind of communicate with each other. And for this setup, one of the main things that has really made it possible is the MIDI Routing Control Center by Creative Labs. And it's this box that you essentially take all of the MIDI ins and outs of all this gear and you plug it into that single box. And then it controls how everything is routed, what different aspects of MIDI are routed to what different pieces of equipment. And then you can save all of those configurations in a template, which is great, because when you want to play in standalone, it needs to be routed one way, and when you want to hook it up to the computer, it needs to be a different way. The next thing that is essential is, how do you take all of the audio outputs from all these different things and not only sum them into a way that you can hear everything clearly, obviously, but then also to be able to record them into the computer, multi-track. And what I've landed on is this MOTU LP32, which is a 4-channel ADAT fiber optic, I think they call it light pipe, digital audio over fiber optic protocol, to take essentially these sets of mic preamps. Right now I'm using the Behringer Ultra Gain ADA8200s, and I'm using 4 of them that through that light pipe, through a fiber optic cable, in and out, go to that main LP32 rack mount. And in all, I get 32 channels of input and output, which is just plenty for all of these synths, but then it's also enough for the, having a fully mic'd drum kit back there and another digital drum kit back there, to kind of have it all hooked up at the same time. And finally, you need a way to kind of capture your performance, or to capture your different pieces of music that you're creating on these various different instruments. And for a standalone sort of way, independent of using it on the computer, I use the Native Instruments Maschine Plus which is a standalone version of the Maschine software and their controllers, that has its own kind of built-in sequencing and song mode, and the software can, of course, run any of your virtual plugin, your virtual synthesizer plugins and effects and that kind of stuff. But the standalone version actually has a subset of the core plugins that are available from Native Instruments built into it. But more so, it's a full-on sampler that you can do drums and sampled instruments and all that kind of stuff on. In this setup, I really only use, the only internal thing I use on there is the drums, which is sometimes sampled, sometimes there's like built-in drum synths that are kind of, analog modeling drum synths that are emulating some classic drum machines like the Roland 808, the 909, all that kind of stuff. I rarely use anything else than that in this setup right here. So the nice thing about the Maschine is that not only does it support creating like all these different kind of sections, or what they call patterns, that you can kind of then perform by turning different ones on and off, but then it kind of groups everything into these things called scenes, which are, think of a scene as like a grouping of a bunch of different patterns that you've recorded. And then on top of that, even once you're kind of ready to create a whole song arrangement, it has a song mode where you can switch over and say, I want this section to play this many times and this section to play this many times, and so forth. And you can kind of map out a whole song. And then even one more layer above that, you have this thing called clips that you can do over a song that essentially allow you to override the sections or the patterns that are happening in this arrangement. You can override one of the particular instruments and do like a performance over the top of it, like a solo or something that spans multiples of these sections that you've defined. So before I give a little demo on how to record all these different things, I suppose I should probably just give a quick little rundown of the different pieces of gear that I have here. First one here is the Roland Juno-X. It's a newish offering from Juno, or from Roland, where they're modeling their classic Juno synths, the Juno 6, the 60, the 106, and then a new engine called the Juno-X engine. And then I've got the Arturia PolyBrute here, which is an amazing 6-voice analog synth that supports this thing called morphing, where you can have two complete different setups, knob positions on, all the various different parameters here. And then you can morph between the two with kind of a master morph knob, or this touch control, what they call the morphy. And instead of it just crossfading between two different sounds, it actually is like taking all of the settings and morphing them into what the other settings are for the other sound that you have established. Then I've got the AMS HydraSynth back here, the rack mount version, or the desktop version, I think they call it. It's another digital synth, kind of like the Juno, but it supports much more flexibility around routing, and the workflow and how you hook things together is really intuitive and really cool. And then over here, I've got the Dave Smith Instruments, which is actually called Sequential. Again, used to be Sequential back in the 70s and 80s, and then Dave Smith Instruments. Dave Smith, one of the designers of a lot of the early synths, all of them maybe, lost the name Sequential and eventually got it back. Anyway, I got the version of the Prophet Rev 2 when it was still Dave Smith Instruments, when it first came out. Growing up, I grew up next to a professional recording studio, and they had a Sequential Prophet 5, which was an amazing experience to be able to play that every chance I got when I was able to go over there. So I've always loved that, Prophet, especially the name and the whole thing, like the Prophet. So when the Rev 2 came out, I was at a point as an adult where I could actually afford, spending the money on that. and it doesn't disappoint. It's a great synth. And then last but not least here, I've got the Sequential Pro-3, which is a mono synth, a 3 oscillator synth that you can play in what's called paraphonic mode, which is a really cool kind of way of being able to play it as if it wasn't mono, because you can trigger each of the oscillators kind of independently. But you can also get some, because there's 3 of them, you can do this cool, like when you're doing the arpeggiator, or when you're feeding a sequence to it, you can have each note use the next oscillator. So it's kind of looping on the 3 different oscillators per note. Anyway, also really inspired. And that's kind of the theme of most of my stuff here. Most of the gear here, the whole purpose of me justifying spending the money on this gear is that each one of them kind of offers this unique thing that, you know, maybe some other gear does too, but the way that it does it is inspiring to me. So I try not to get too many things that are redundant. And I feel like these, you know, 5 pieces of these 5 synthesizers are each kind of unique in their own way. So yeah, the only other piece of gear here, which I haven't already kind of talked about, is the Arturia KeyStep Pro, which I used to use in place of the Maschine because it's kind of a sequencer that you can do like sets of sequences, and it supports 4 different parts, and it has kind of this drum mode for triggering drums, or drum machine. And I was using that for a long time, but again, it's only 4 parts, and there's 5 synths here, and on top of that I was also using a Roland TR-8S drum machine, and it just wasn't enough channels in order to have everything going at the same time. So I still do use the sequencer on that to capture into the Maschine for like a particular loop or pattern or whatnot. Also, I have it set up because the HydraSynth doesn't have a keyboard. I mean, it's got some touch pads to do polyphonic aftertouch stuff on the pads itself, but I use this as kind of the main controller for the HydraSynth. Of course, it can trigger any of these. So if I want to use it sequencer to sequence any of these, I can do that just through simply telling it which MIDI channel I want to use. Each of the each of the synths is its own MIDI channel. And in the case of the Juno-X, it's 4 MIDI channels, or actually 5, because it actually has 4 different kind of model parts that you can trigger all at the same time or separately. But all the other synths each have their own dedicated MIDI channel. And then they all go through the MRCC, and then they come into the Maschine. And I've got a template set up on the Maschine where I've got these groups, and each group can correspond to a MIDI channel coming in or going out. And so each one of the synths has its own kind of group. So that allows you to, when you're recording, anytime you record any one of these different things, it always goes into the corresponding group that is hooked up to the corresponding MIDI channel that the synth is set to. So I'll give a little demo on how this kind of works and show you how you can kind of record all this stuff. You can kind of layer it as you're recording, as it's looping, sometimes without even having to stop it. You can just keep kind of layering as you go, which is kind of fun. So let's do that. For the sake of keeping this fairly simple, I'm going to try to keep it short and really just kind of demo how you can start layering all these things together on the fly. And whenever you're doing this, at least I have a tendency to just start zoning out and letting things play for a long time, or if I mess up on something, I'll have to go fix it, that kind of stuff. But I'll try to keep it simple so I don't do any of that kind of stuff, because that'll just get boring, right, watching me do that. So I'm just going to start this recording, looping, if you will. And the way it works is that it's going to sit and wait for me to start playing something. As soon as I start playing one of these instruments, that corresponding group, which corresponds to the MIDI channel, will start just recording whatever I start playing. And the cool thing about the Maschine is that it, at least the setting that I use on it, is when you have it looping and you have it armed for record globally, it will sit there anticipating that you're going to start recording, and you'll see that, like, if I actually start this, you'll see that it's just sitting here looping. This is the indicator that shows the current loop that you're in, like the length of it, and you'll notice it's just sitting on a single bar right now. But as soon as I start recording something, it will establish that bar that I started in as the first bar in the loop that eventually will get created. And as soon as you disarm the record, it'll establish that length of whatever you just recorded as your loop, and then just start looping that. And you can just continue that process over and over again for each one of the different instruments to kind of build up layers of different sounds. So I'm going to start with the Prophet, and we'll do a little electric piano thing that it has here, or a sound on it, and you'll see what I mean. So you can see that for the Prophet, now that's not just looping on a single bar, it's actually playing this larger pattern that I just did. There was the one, and I think it ended up being an 8-bar pattern. So now I disarmed it, and that's what kind of initiated it to start then looping what I had just recorded. But if I want to move on to a different instrument, I just rearm it, and it's going to wait for me again. Again, you can see that for this channel, which is the Pro-3, it, again, looped. And you can see I even messed up there a little bit. But if I can actually go into, and I said I wouldn't do this, but if I go into the events of that, I can see the individual notes. And I can see that I kind of messed up that one right there. So now I can go through and just clear that note out and move this one. There we go. Yep, I also had a little double note there that I did. So I'm going to take that one, clear that one. I think that fixed it. I may need to jog this note over a little bit. Here we come to this. Okay, that one's good. That was just a little demo of how you can go in and fix things if you did mess it up. Or I could just undo it, that one part that I did, and try again. But there you have it. So now what I'll do, go back out here to this view, and then I'll just hit record again and move on to the Juno here. So now, establish that loop. Channel E is the Juno, this purple one. Okay, so now it's doing its thing. I skipped over the Hydra, which right now is being controlled by this. So if I switch over to that, again, just kind of messed around in the same scale and just throwing a bunch of notes in there. Normally, if I was doing this, I would start thinking about how I can not have everything happening all at once and to kind of keep it simple. But for the sake of this demo, I'll just keep layering. We got one more to do, the PolyBrute here. So that's on F. So I'll just arm again for that. And it's waiting. Here we go. Okay, now we've got all the layers. Now, I could throw some drums on here, or I could duplicate. So all of these different patterns that I just created are in their individual groups, but they're also a set of patterns. And so what I can do is, so you can see here that we've got a scene and all these patterns. A scene is really just which pattern in the lists of each of these groups corresponding patterns that you want to be playing for that scene. So what I could do right now is just duplicate this scene. So now I've got two scenes that are exactly the same. But what I can do for this scene that I just duplicated is I can drop certain instruments out of it, right? Say I want to drop everything out but the bass and the PolyBrute, the Pro-3 and the PolyBrute. So now if I wanted to, I could actually create a new scene, or sorry, a new pattern in one of the other instruments for this new scene that's a different pattern. So let's do that. Let's actually do that with the Prophet here. And what I'm going to do, since I have the Prophet's pattern turned off, if I hit arm and I start recording, it'll automatically create a new pattern in this scene. So if I just do that, I totally screwed that one up. So I was a little off on the timing there. So I'm actually just going to undo that. And while it's playing, I can just go over here and undo it. So now that went away, but of course all my other stuff is still there, because every time you record and disarm the record, it then essentially saves the state, so you can undo back to that point before you did that. But I'm going to try that again for the Prophet on this new pattern. And I'm going to kind of wait for the one. Here we go. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I do have it set to quantize the notes when I record. So while I'm recording, it's gonna snap the notes that I'm playing to the nearest grid marker, and in this case it's 16th notes. You can turn that off too. So if you want to do a more organic sort of feel and let it be slightly off or have a little bit more of that human feel, you can do that too. I tend to do it this way unless I know deliberately that I want a part that's like a solo part that's got nuances that aren't going to sound good if it snaps to that grid. So now we can see here that the Prophet part, it created a new pattern here, right? And that pattern is selected for this scene, but if I switch back to the other scene, it's going to actually then go back to the set of patterns that were part of that scene. So right here. So now this is the other parts that I had already recorded as part of the other scene. So one thing, we don't have any drums here or any percussion. So what I can do here, just like recording one of the synths, I can start recording a drum part. These are the drums that I have here, just kind of some default electronic drums. So now, establish that. And that now that that clip is actually established, and this kind of works better for a drum part, because sometimes you want to start with just that, but say I want to add some hi-hats to it too. So you can just kind of then have that looping. The nice thing about using the internal stuff on the machine too is that, especially for drums, it has, you know, each one of these pads is kind of its own sample or synth or whatnot, and you can just kind of switch over to its own internal mixer of all those different parts. And then say I want to turn down that hat that I just recorded is a little bit too loud. Switch over to another scene. And on this other scene that we created, remember I hadn't recorded a drum part. I could record another drum part for this, or just have it play the other pattern that we just recorded for drums. But you can see here that you can kind of then, you know, create all these different scenes with all these different patterns, and then you can actually switch into the song mode where you can kind of tell it how you want those different scenes to play out, how many times they loop, and how long, you know, how long they are, the position they are, how you can repeat them, and all that kind of stuff. So you can see that very quickly you can just get a cool, you know, vibe or loop thing happening without having to go through and configure all this kind of stuff. It's all just kind of ready to go. And yeah, so that's why I kind of call it like a milestone. Getting to this point where everything's working right, so that I can just come over and turn it on and start doing what I just showed you. It's great. You know, of course, as soon as you introduce a new piece of gear, you got to incorporate it in, or inevitably things change because you evolve. And this is just kind of how I'm doing it right now. But it's great fun. And, you know, the nice thing is that I've kind of established that inside of here, and I can just, you know, play it at will, right? But if I want to, I can just switch over my template in the way that the MIDI is routing, and have like Ableton be the timing master, or the clock, the MIDI clock that gets sent out to this. So when I start recording there, it starts this, you know, sequence that I have going here, and it records all the MIDI and all the audio and everything into the computer. So that's kind of how, like, I get it to this point where you kind of have a loose structure of a song that you've kind of hashed through and figured out, and then you're ready to dump it into the computer so that you can do all the fit and finish and add other plugins or whatever else that you want to add to it. Add vocals, add guitars, add real drums, all kinds of stuff. So the one last bit, I have to say that the one, like, you know, of course there's pros and cons to anything. And obviously the pros in this situation, it's all ready to go. It's very tactile. You have direct control, you get knob per function sort of deal where you can kind of tweak things, and it's kind of a sound designer way of like being able to compose everything without having to mess with like troubleshooting, you know, stuff not working correctly. But one of the cons is that when, say I've just did that little piece and I need to leave now, how do you save? So you can save the file inside of the machine that saves all the sequence data and any internal stuff that you did inside of the machine, but that doesn't save out any individual tweaks that you've done to any of the presets or, you know, sounds that you've established on the different synths. So you literally, if you've created something from scratch, or you pulled up an existing preset and you tweaked any, you're going to need to go save each one of those before you turn everything off, or obviously you lose all of those changes that you made. The pain in the ass for that is that each one of these synths has its own little way of scrolling through letters to name your presets. So in the event that you did start from scratch on some of these synths, there is that extra step of having to go and name everything. And then on top of that, you keep a little notepad of which presets for each one of the groups or each one of the different synths that you used for a particular song that you saved here. So the next time you come to kind of continue work on it, you can load it all up to the state that it was in when you stopped last time. So it's a disadvantage, but I think it's an okay trade-off for the experience that you get in recording this way. So in closing, I guess, I hope you enjoyed seeing this little way that I've got all this gear set up and how it's working for me. It's nice having it be in this state that you can just go turn it on and start, playing with all this gear. I do plan to add more gear to this, or to change the configuration as we do. But I feel like the way that it's established with the routing and the audio and everything, it'd be fairly easy to change stuff around and still maintain that kind of reliability of being able to turn it on and go. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe and all that stuff if you want to. Let me know if there's any part of this that you would like to see additional video on or explanation for. Yeah, but I encourage you to go take a look at any of these pieces of gear. There's tons of videos out there that go way deeper into them than I went here. And I don't want to be redundant. There's lots of content out there on all this stuff. I encourage you to go check it out because it's some really cool stuff that it's inspiring, at least to me. So until next time, take it easy.